Welcome to the Write to Ignite podcast, where we talk to authors who are writing to ignite the next generation with a heart for the Lord. I'm Kyle Morgan.
And I'm Brenda Covert.
Now, Brenda, I have a question for you. Did you read any fantasy books when you were a teenager?
I don't know. I've read a lot after growing up, but I don't think I read any as a teenager. Not that I can recall. There was, the teen books, the angsty 15-year-old girl books from Scholastic. I read those.
Well, our guest today is kind of an expert on fantasy. Emily Golus is an award-winning fantasy author with 20 years of professional writing experience. She aims to engage, inspire, and show how small acts of courage and love create meaningful change. Her first novel, Escape to Vindor, won the 2018 Selah Award for young adult fiction, and a spin-off novel, Crack the Stone, won the 2024 Kudos Award for fiction and was named a Realm Award finalist. Emily lives in upstate South Carolina with her husband, Mike, who is her greatest supporter. They have 2 active little boys and enjoy hiking, making Thai food, and exploring small towns in the Carolinas. Emily, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So can you briefly share what kind of a world is Vindor? How would you describe it?
Oh, yeah. So Vindor is a diverse world where I kind of just went wild with the world building because it was for fun originally. And so it's got like 12 different people groups. There's like everything from sort of European medieval. There's like an Anglo-Saxon group. There's an underground nation. There is a Japanese-inspired nation. There's a West African-inspired empire. So just... and then there's centaurs and mermaids and fairies and just basically anything I could get in. Like, I kind of just went wild. But I've been building this world for over 20 years, actually.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
yes. So
That
it
was
just
going to
kind of
be
has
my
been
next
growing.
question. How long does
Yes.
it take to create a world? 20 years.
Well, it doesn't necessarily take 20 years. I've just been doing it for over 20 years. So I think I started in 2002. But this is not a prerequisite. Like if you want to write fantasy, you don't have to do that. You really don't. It's just the part that I really enjoy. I love learning about cultures and people. And anytime I read something or hear something cool, I just sort of stick it into Vindor somewhere. So that's what you get.
So it's an ever-expanding
Do
universe.
It really is because, I made up the 12 nations, but I didn't know a ton about them. So my first book, I had named some, but I really didn't know what it was really like. And so it's been fun with some of the follow-up novels to be like, okay, this city, I wonder who lives there. I know like 1 or 2 facts, but now I can sort of like world build a new city, because I'm always enjoying digging deeper and finding out who's there and conflicts that the people have, and it just keeps going on and on.
large enough that you can keep stories going.
Yes. So I'll have general details, but I found a random city on the map, and for Crack the Stone I was like, okay, who are these people, and created this whole city. And I was like, all right, this was really interesting. It's a market city, and what is that like? Where there's a lot of different people groups who all come together and interact at the same time. And then I've got the merfolk nations, and I'm like, I wonder what goes on down there. So I can, just sort of add things in. And it's, this is the part that I really enjoy the most. And so I just get to keep doing it. And I guess when Vindor's all filled up, I'll just start a new world.
What is the hardest part about keeping world building consistent across multiple books in the same universe?
Oh, yeah, that's hard. I have to have files where I'm just like, okay, what have I said about what people group? where have I put, I'll have like in one book, I'll have, oh, the different clothing colors mean different things. And then I was like halfway through Crack the Stone and I was like, wait, what was that system? Like, and I had to go back and like look it up and then write it all down. So keeping track of the details can be difficult. So it's just good note taking. The other thing I did was I have to have all my books take place within the same 10-year period because I guess I'm a glutton for punishment. And so things cannot happen after Mists of Paracosmia ends, my second book in the duology. Like that is the end of the Vindor stories. Things cannot go beyond that point. And they can't go too much before that point either because of the way I've set up my world. So I'm like, I have to cram in all these stories and there are sometimes shared villains and I have to be like, I have like a flow chart. Who's doing what when? And if I want to write a new book, I have to figure out like exactly when does this happen? Who is where? So just good note taking. And in the absence of good note taking, the ability to go back and read your own books and be like, oh, okay, write that down. Okay, making an outline, studying my own books so that I don't contradict myself.
Yeah, sounds complicated, but I know there are readers out there that would be fact checking your fantasy.
I was that kind of person, so it seems appropriate somehow.
It seems like fantasy authors are almost anthropologists slash historians, like of their own worlds. Like, but that's really important. Like you as the author cannot forget things because the readers will definitely know.
They will catch you. And like because I'm interested in anthropology and stuff, like I don't know if it's like just I go on rabbit trails or I just get obsessed with like food, crops. Where do these crops come from? They can't eat chocolate because they don't have access to a tropical place. So in tropical, we get coffee from tropical places. You can't have coconuts. You can't have tea. Maybe you can have tea. I actually found out I could. Like, it's just this big thing. And I'm like, I care deeply. I'm not sure my readers do, but it's always nice to have a meal nicely described and to figure out what they're eating and why they're eating those particular things to me is very satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, like, when you're world building, how do you find moments for your world to be original? Because there are so many fantasy story worlds that already exist. And, you want to build off of those, but how do you keep yours unique?
I think part of it is, I read a lot of fantasy, but I don't set out to recreate other things that I've read. Now, I mean, all of us fantasy writers, whether we, are conscious of it or not, we're all influenced by some of the same people. Everyone's influenced by Tolkien because he kind of brought fantasy into the modern world. Like it did exist ahead of time. We're all indebted to some of the same people, but I try very hard not to source my stories off of other fiction. I try to source it off of like real cultures, or real places, or original ideas like, what if you had, for example, an underground city? How would that function? Now, the underground city in Vindor, which has multiple levels and it's like caves and stuff like that, all dug out of the limestone, is based on a real place in Turkey. They found these ruins. And so I saw that and I was like, that has to go in Vindor somewhere. So trying to pull from the real world and pull from actual cultures as much as I can, kind of, number one, makes it original, and number two, makes it feel real because, I'm pulling a lot of details that seem to fit together because they do fit together somewhere in the world. And so it feels more authentic when I'm pulling, not just making everything up, but sourcing from, real combinations of things. So that's sort of how I do it.
Yeah, there's I think in Turkey as well, there's Cappadocia. Have you seen?
I've heard of that, but remind me what that is.
It's got like the big cone, like carved
Oh.
cities like high up in the mountains, like they're cone shaped. Yeah, they're weird.
Oh, yeah, there is a lot of cool things. There are some places in West Africa. I think it might be in either Mali or I don't think it's Nigeria, but there are villages where they will paint the outside of their houses, because they're like this mud or stucco kind of thing, and they paint it in these wild patterns. And I was like, okay, that's going in. And so the painted buildings and the mud architecture, which has a very smooth look to it, it's like hand smoothed, and it's very hard to, you don't see it other places necessarily unless they're building out of earth. And so trying to, but there's so many things, you know, and I've had to tame things down, like the underground city in Derinkuyu, also in Turkey. That's the one where it's underground. They used actual fire to light things. How they did not all suffocate with the smoke, I have no idea, because you'd be like 3 levels down and the smoke has to go up. So for Vindor, I'm like, they have magical smokeless fire, because that's the only way I can figure this out. And I just, you know, truth is stranger than fiction. Like sometimes I have to say, okay, reality, you're a little too wild. I gotta tame you down so my fantasy readers will believe this.
But when you're creating a fantasy world, where do you start? Maps, culture, history, or characters?
Well, I do a lot of times start with the story, you know, and then the world building sort of fills in around that story. So I guess I would start originally with the characters or the situation the characters are in. And then after that, it's culture, because to me, that's the most interesting part of fantasy. Architecture is really cool. Food, again, somewhat obsessed with food history. You know, all of these things are interesting, but to me, it's culture that's the most fascinating, because you can have 2 people from different backgrounds who look at the exact same problem in completely different ways. And to be able to explore different approaches to life, and again, not good approaches and bad approaches, just different approaches. Like for example, I've got 2 cultures. One is this culture that like is kind of out in the plains, and they, you know, are herders, and they move their wagons around, and they're all about personal expression and freedom and, you know, art, and they're, you know, they're free people, but they're fighting with each other all the time. Like there's like this price to freedom where, you know, you get to do, you know, express yourself, but like that kind of, you bump into the other people groups. So they're actually very warlike at times, and that causes them problems. Whereas the culture that lives in that underground city, like you're on the knife's edge of survival. Everyone has to work together. You can't just dump your trash anywhere. Like there has to be like rules for how this works. And so you have this very communal society where the good of everybody is forefront, but it can also be stifling, you know? So it's looking at 2 extremes and saying, not that one's good and one's bad, but there are advantages and disadvantages to do both approaches. And, you know, and we can learn from that both in the real world and then also fantasy as a way where you can sort of explore these ideas, and you can sort of, you know, tilt things maybe a little more extreme to make a point in a shorter story. But to express these kind of ideas through fantasy. And so the reader has to sort of figure out which approach is better. Is one completely, you know, completely good, completely bad? Probably not. It's a mixed bag. You know, it's that kind of empathy and that kind of understanding and that kind of wisdom that allows you to love your neighbor better and interact with people. Maybe their culture's not different, but their personality's different. And to be able to sort of code switch between, okay, maybe they do this way because of their background, and I can be okay with that. If they're loud and boisterous and want to be the life of the party, and I would rather sit in my house and read, like I can just understand they're different and you know, and interact with people who are different than myself. And I feel like fantasy helps you do that. Learning about different cultures helps you do that, because we're called to love our neighbors. And even though we have to love our neighbors as ourselves, we have to understand our neighbors are not ourselves, and they have different preferences. And part of wisdom, part of biblical wisdom, is knowing how to treat the other person the way they want to be treated, you know, and not just, well, I like loud parties, they must like loud parties too, you know, but having wisdom when you interact with other people. And I feel like fantasy, and fiction in general, when you're getting into another person's point of view, like that really helps you to imagine being in someone else's shoes, and that empathy helps you to understand how to deal with this person in a kind and wise way.
I love that because that was one of my questions is there's a lot of Christian fantasy authors, and I was going to ask like, what is it about the fantasy genre that attracts you as a Christian author?
And that's part of it. The other thing is fantasy allows you, and science fiction, they both allow you to explore ideas sort of for themselves with some of the familiar taken away. So, we're called to love our neighbors, but we all have these loopholes that we've made. Like, we're supposed to love everybody, but not that guy. I don't like him. Jesus clearly didn't mean him. And we have all these loopholes and these exceptions and like, oh, well, it's complicated. And we teach these to our kids, sometimes inadvertently. And so when we navigate through life, we know it's true, but we have all these reasons why it's not true in this situation. And what fantasy and science fiction do is they strip that away. So when you have, in Escape to Vindor, which is the first book in the series, you have two characters, a goblin and a centaur, which I don't know if you knew, goblins and centaurs don't like each other. And you didn't know that because I made that up. I totally made that up. And the thing is, you see these two characters, you have no context for their culture. You don't have a dog in this fight, in a sense. You're not like, oh, yeah, I've met some centaurs. They're pretty terrible. Like, you don't have that. And so you look at these two characters and the way they interact more objectively. You don't have this sort of, your own prejudice or your own baggage or things. And so you can watch what's going on as the reader and have a much more objective view. Are they being good to each other? Are they, that was out of line. When she said that to him, it was out of line. Like, that was not, he didn't do that. She's holding something against him that he didn't do. That sort of thing. And so when you strip away the familiar, you can sort of look at the ideas for themselves without all the baggage that we tend to bring to reality. So, and then hopefully learn something from that and maybe get rid of some of that baggage when you are interacting with other people.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you kind of answered my question because I also know Christian readers who avoid Christian fantasy because they say it's not real. They don't understand it. I had a favorite mermaid book probably about 10 years ago. It was Christian fantasy. And it could speak to biblical truths that in any other place you might have thought was preachy and boring, but this was the mermaid culture in this particular book, that they were closer to God than normal people are, that they had a deeper understanding of God. And so everything that mermaid did, I was fascinated.
Yeah. The other thing that fantasy is really good at is externalizing some internal things or illustrating some spiritual things. So, for example, when I was 19, and this is when I started writing Escape to Vindor, I wasn't really writing it to begin with. I was just thinking about it. And one of the inspirations was I was struggling with a lot of anxiety. Like, it was affecting the way I was making decisions or not making decisions. And I knew it was a problem. I could feel how this burden of anxiety that I didn't understand was affecting me very poorly. And so I imagined, what if it was a monster, like a dragon or a shadow monster or something? And I'm in a fantasy story. How would I approach it? Well, first of all, how does it attack? It doesn't attack directly. It doesn't hurt me. It just convinces me that something else is going to hurt me and then gets me to act in a way that actually sabotages myself. And it was through that process of externalizing something that is abstract, and saying, this is what anxiety looks like. This is how it acts. What if it were outside of me and I could take a more objective look? That actually, in some ways, helped me process what I was going through. And there's fantasy tropes like the journey. You always have, the fantasy journey. And that's one of those things. Well, it's a great metaphor for life or for undertaking any kind of goal, this journey motif is actually, I think, really helpful, because on a journey, you have to be prepared for it. You don't know what's coming. There's all these metaphors for life that we sort of intuitively understand. And we can sort of learn something about our own lives when we, again, sort of take it out of the abstract and say, well, what if it looked like something? What if this was literally a journey and not just like a series of tasks I was doing? What would be my obstacles? And so again, I feel like it's super helpful. Even if it's not an allegory, these things can help us to make sense of life sometimes.
Well, yeah, and even it doesn't matter what story structure you use, they
Mhm.
all have the same similarities. They all have the transformation.
Mhm.
They all have these things. And I'm sure some people will disagree that, we get it from the Bible, but it
Mhm.
seems like every structure is based off of the way God tells his story through
Mhm.
people. It
Mhm.
just seems to be
Mhm.
whether or not you do, Joseph Campbell's, or you do Save the Cat, or you do, any of
Mhm.
these other ones.
Mhm.
It seems to be that, oh yeah, this is how real life works. Like,
Yeah, yeah. Except in a little slightly neater package,
yeah, yeah,
because but it's easier to understand when you strip away some of the, and then I have to get up every morning and brush my teeth, like
yeah.
you can skip all of that part in a fantasy story, which is great, it helps you focus on the parts that are more significant. It help, because our lives are filled with, little cluttery things that we can get distracted by or hung up on. And there's nothing like a good journey to sort of help you figure out, like, what are the big things in life? And that metaphor can be super helpful, I find.
Yeah. So you're telling me that centaurs don't brush their teeth?
It's never come up, actually. I'm trying to think if I ever did establish that. I may have it in my notes somewhere. And that's one of the things with fantasy is, or with any story, I'm always like, when you're world building, you have to figure out, okay, what do they eat and where do they go to the bathroom? And that's dumb. But if you have like a spaceship or you're like on a desert asteroid or something, like, if you cannot explain to me what these people eat or where they go to the bathroom, like, I'm not following your story. If you're out, like, if your characters are out in the woods, like, we get it. You don't need to go into it, you don't need to explain. So you can skip the parts that are not as interesting unless you want to get into the details of what do they eat and that sort of thing. I'm not saying you have to write that in. I just say it has to
Yeah.
be explainable.
No, that totally makes sense.
Let's look at Crack the Stone for a minute. You wrote
Sure.
that to reimagine Les Mis. So what
Hmm.
inspired you to retell that story, and how did you make it your own?
Oh, sure. Well, I was actually invited to a multi-author series. So there were 9 of us authors. All of us took a different classic and respun it as fantasy. And we kind of all collaborated on, not, like, bounced ideas off of each other and did the marketing and stuff together. It was a really cool experience. So the idea of retelling a classic was not my idea, but when I was invited by Alison Tebow, who headed up the project, she said, "Do you want to do a retelling of a classic?" And I got the message, and immediately, like, within 10 minutes, I was like, Les Mis, but with goblins. And I tried to think of other ideas, but I'm like, no, that's it. And the two reasons are, the goblins is explainable because I have a goblin main character in both Escape to Vindor and Mists of Paracosmia, which had already come out. And I was really interested in the goblin world and, like, where what goes on down there, because we have a character who escaped from there, but what is it like? So this idea of someone escaping from a prison, kind of like with Jean Valjean in Les Mis, he is released from prison. In Crack the Stone, she escapes from prison, so there's a little bit of a difference. But that idea of prison, I was like, okay, there's a prison camp, and she got out of it. So that's where the goblin idea came from. Les Mis I chose because it is one of the most beautiful pictures of redemption in all of literature. Like, I just get goosebumps. Like, I'm getting goosebumps right now just thinking about that story. The convict Jean Valjean, who is bad, When he escapes from prison, he is a bad person. And he is given this gift of mercy from someone he betrayed. So he goes and stays with the bishop. The bishop is the only person in town who's nice to him after he's released from jail. And then he robs the bishop. And then he is brought back to the bishop and they say, did this man steal it? He's like, oh, no, 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 no. I gave him that silver. And in fact, I meant to give him these 2 pieces as well. And when Jean Valjean, like he was about to go back to jail forever for breaking parole, like he got 1 strike and he's out. And he's given this gift of this silver. And Bishop Muriel says, you must use this to do good. And it is just how he can't go back to his life of sin. He can't do it. He's almost angry with the bishop because you've ruined everything for me. And so it's that story, and then the redemption by grace and mercy. Then you have the Javert character who is like, I am righteous because I have worked so hard. And Javert has a heart of stone. He does not care about other people, but he will follow the letter of the law. Just this picture of salvation by mercy and grace versus legalism. And just, the adoption of a child and the heart opening up and all that. So that's why I had to do Les Mis for Crack the Stone. And I did change some things, obviously. Jean Valjean is now a 3-foot-tall female goblin escaping from prison. And I gender swapped. The reason I did the gender swap was because my main character, Valshara, she adopts a little boy. A little human boy that she does not mean to adopt. Whoops. And then doesn't know anything about humans. Like, she's only seen them like once or twice. She doesn't know what they eat. She's trying to feed him sticks. Like, she does not know anything because, she's just escaped from prison underground and now she's in this like forest and she's like, I don't even understand what trees are. But she accidentally adopts a 5-year-old, as one does. And this child is now this liability, but she also starts to care very deeply for him while she's trying to return him home. And the reason I switched the gender was because it was, again, Les Mis is a father-daughter story. And I found that I was just filtering too much. This is what I would do as a mother for my boys, but what if I was a man and this was my daughter? I was just like, why am I filtering this so much? So I was just like, okay, it's a little boy and she's a mother now suddenly. And so I was able to pour a lot of my own experience into that whole, kids are great. They're also baffling and like very intense. And I think I've gotten in over my head here,
Right,
and the fun, yeah, right. And the fun thing is my son, David, was 3 or 4 at the time when I was writing this. And he just started talking early and his grammar was so strange and he would just say the strangest things. So I would write them down. And then I have this 5-year-old child in this book. I'm like, oh my goodness, I have a whole list of funny things this kid can say because they are all things my son has actually said. And so the character of Makosi, or the cassette character, he basically speaks David. So he speaks. And there was one time I was like, David, come over here. How would you describe a boat? And so he described a boat in a very childish way. I'm like, Makosi describes a boat, like just ask him, okay, 5-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, how would you describe this? Great, going in the story. So
that's awesome.
Yeah. So literally he speaks David. But that was a lot of fun. So it was the redemption style story, but then also the parenthood story. And I became a mom at 35. I got married later in life and, so I had been on my own and done all these things and gotten set in my ways. And then I have children and I'm like, what now? Like, what's going on right now? So that sort of shock of, okay, life has taken a very different turn now and I'm responsible for this very needy little being. But at the same time, I would, while sometimes they annoy me. I would also die for this little guy. Like, you know, there's that weird paradox of please just go to sleep, but also I would fight a bear for you, you know?
I love that. You put in your questionnaire the idea of New Testament values, and I wanted to ask you, can you explain the difference between Old Testament values and New Testament values? Is there a difference? What's your take on this?
Oh, that is more of a theological question. So when I say New Testament values, what I'm saying is like things that are actually in the Bible and not just cultural. So because I grew up with a very cultural Christianity, we do these things even though they're not in the Bible because they're right, because we know they're right, because we do them. And I remember as like a seventh grader being like, that's really weird that, you know, the kind of clothes you wear is so important and it's not even in the Bible. Like, so when I talk about New Testament values, that's what I'm talking about. The difference between New Testament and Old Testament is I feel like New Testament, obviously with Jesus, like the completed picture of Jesus, and then basically, you know, Paul explaining, this is how you live now because of Jesus. You have to be humble. You have to be kind. You have to be generous. You have to be forgiving. You have to control your tongue. And all of these things are still in the Old Testament. It's just, they're a lot clearer in the New Testament. Like,
Yeah.
do these things now that you know Jesus. And so that's all I mean by that. Like all this stuff, if you read the book of Proverbs, like all these things are still there. It's just a lot more direct and easier to understand when it's spelled out in the New Testament.
Yes.
And again, not that the New Testament's all about, you know, rules, but it is, the book of Romans is like 11 chapters about the gospel of grace, and then like 3 or 4 chapters about, okay, now this is how we live in response. So it's not a rule book, but it is very clear. All right, how does this look now as we're living out grace and the love of Christ? How do we show that? So that's all I mean by that.
Yeah, so
Old Testament values, still in there.
Yeah,
But
you're talking about the difference of like, Welch's grape juice only, and how we
yes,
dress and
yeah.
that kind of stuff.
Yes, yes. And I think it's because, I feel like I was kind of bamboozled as a kid by these very highly legalistic churches that valued their own interpretations more than they valued Christian unity, and that Jesus prayed for in his Gethsemane prayer. I remember reading that and being like, oh no, like we have messed up. And it's a really interesting, story of how the Holy Spirit kind of Bibled me out of that type of legalistic Christianity, because I kept reading the Bible and I'm like, oh, so we're like doing it wrong. And that wasn't just me being super smart. It was like the Holy Spirit working in my life and just bringing the right passages to me, as I was reading at the right times. But I feel like because I was kind of bamboozled in a sense by well-meaning people, and then I've sort of seen people be deceived into much darker things. And I'm like, we were not in a cult, but we were cult adjacent, where we could have become a cult very quickly. We were just set up the way that our churches were set up. And I'm not trying to, just like take a whole denomination or whatever and bring them down. I'm just saying legalistic churches where you have one very powerful person in charge or a couple very powerful people in charge, and you can't ask questions and you have to do things your way. I'm like, that is just a hop, skip, and a jump away from this person taking even more control. And so to me, it is so vital that we understand, what does the Bible actually teach? What is the gospel exactly? Because anyone can take some verses and proof text their way into why you have to wear your hair a certain way or something, or why you have to. Anyone can do that. So to me, understanding what are the New Testament values that will protect you from being manipulated into thinking that Christianity is about some other agenda, when really it is about Jesus Christ, him crucified, and us living in the reality of that, living in his grace and forgiveness, and then extending that love to other people, and being that light in the world where, the love of Christ is coming out through us, and not trying to build somebody else's kingdom, or somebody else's ego, or whatever it is. So that's why that's so important. And one of the things that I really want my readers to understand, even though my books are like, they're Christian, they're not always very, very markedly Christian. It's all in the bones. The stories, the values are there. Now, Crack the Stone, again, is a Les Miserables retelling. That is a very Christian book. And so the parallels are there to salvation by grace. It's redemption through a merciful act. Like, if you've got your thinking cap on, you can see, okay, I see where this is, how this is an illustration of salvation by grace. But it's some of my other books, like Mists of Paracosmia, doesn't have a super strong Christian message where you think, traditional, Christian fantasy, but the bones of it are like, what does it look like to be a hero? It looks like sacrificing yourself for your friends. Where have we heard that before? Laying down your life for your friends. This is the sort of thing that I'm trying to bake into my stories, where even if they don't have mentions of God directly, and again, sometimes they allude to God, sometimes they don't, but the bones are Christian and the values are Christian. And again, trying to focus on New Testament things, like Crack the Stone. There is this emphasis at the end about generosity and hospitality, and I took that directly from New Testament passages. I looked at where we are told we must be hospitable and we must be generous to the poor, and I'm like, reworded that a little bit and put it right in. I don't know if everyone will catch it, but these are biblical values, but ones that maybe don't get as much airtime as some of the other things. So that's my approach, and I want, again, my readers to be able to empathize with other people. So because we need to be able to do that in order to fulfill the commandment of loving your neighbor. All of these things are just so vital to the Christian life, and it doesn't have to have like Christian slapped over it, So that's sort of how I approach my work. And again, Escape to Vindor has some more direct Christian messaging in parts of it, but it's not always super obvious. So
Yeah, I don't know if you know it's a graphic novel, American Born Chinese, but it won like the National Book
oh,
Award or something.
okay,
And
I've heard of it, but I'll have to check that one out.
there's a moment where this, again, it's like Chinese mythology, but this god is talking to I think it's the Monkey King or something.
Mhm.
There's a passage there where I'm like, that's a psalm. And I
Mhm.
looked up, and yeah, the writer's
Yeah.
Catholic. He put it in there. He just rephrased it.
Yeah.
I'm like, wait a minute, like I caught that. Like,
Mhm. Mhm.
it's like, oh, that wasn't just a accident. That was
Yeah.
purposeful. Like, yeah.
Right. Well, and the thing is too, I don't just market to Christian readers. I'm at all sorts of events, and I'm marketing to anybody who's looking for clean fantasy for their teenagers. And, some of the books that I'm working on are a little less overtly Christian, but again, they still have those Christian bones, those New Testament bones in them, or at least that's what I'm trying to do. How do we interact with people in the world? Am I the chosen one? The answer is no, you probably aren't. Just, stop. I really, no, you are not the most special person who's ever walked the earth. So maybe you should have some humility and learn to get along with other people. So C.S. Lewis talked about his conversion to Christianity in a sense, started with reading the book Phantastes by George MacDonald. I don't know if you've ever read Phantastes. It's weird. I love it. It's so strange. It's like Alice in Wonderland for adults in like harder language, and you're just like, what is happening? Like there's all these cool like scenes, and you're just like, okay, so the music box exploded. Not sure. Okay, now we're talking to a statue. Cool. But I love it. And that story, C.S. Lewis talks about before he converted to Christianity, he credits that book with baptizing his imagination. And if you read it, it is not like Christian allegory or anything. It's just, I mean, there's some cool, interesting ideas where there's this shadow that the man casts this shadow and he thinks he's so great, but then his shadow like makes all the flowers wither wherever he goes. And he's like, oh no, like maybe I'm not so great. Like, so there's some symbolism there. But C.S. Lewis talked about this book baptized his imagination. And he said something along the lines of that converted me first. Before I went to the theology and was convinced fully. And he said, because the main character, Anodos, was looking for something. He was searching for something. And he's like, later on, I realized that thing he was searching for was holiness. But before he even ever quite understood the symbolism or what it was, C.S. Lewis understood this book is about reaching for something that is different than me, something that's holy. And that changed his perspective on things. And so I've taken that sort of that as, not that I'm hoping to baptize people's imaginations. Like, I'm not like, I'm going to do that for other people. Like, I'd love to. But that sort of approach where if you're writing good stories that are interesting, that are engaging, that have good emotional heart to them, that speak to people, and they have these New Testament bones in them, and sometimes even, like an illustration of redemption by grace, that I hope that somebody who maybe is on the fence about Christianity or it's not really on their radar or was burned by the church, like that they would see something like this, and this could maybe be a piece of the puzzle that later on they can point back to and say, this taught me something, even if it wasn't super directly clear what it was that it taught me. Again, that's aspirational. I would love for that to happen. I'm not saying it, that it does, but that would be my goal.
All right. Have you ever, I'm going to assume you have because most of us have, but have you ever had a creative dry spell? And if so, how did you work your way through it?
Oh yeah, no, I really did. So I worked on Escape to Vindor beginning in 2002 when I was 19. And I worked on that book and God, I didn't work on it. And but it was like 13 years in the process of writing, mostly because I made horrible mistakes and had to go back and fix everything. So, but I had worked on that book. And then the idea for Mists of Paracosmia, while I was still working on the first draft of Vindor, I was thinking about Paracosmia. And then when I finally published both books, I was like, well, those are my books. Those are the ones I've thought about for the past 14, 15 years. Now what? And the interesting thing that happened in my life was I was, single for a long time. I was always working on this book. And then basically the same month that I got engaged, I also got my publishing contract. And everything changed very quickly. And then basically the month after Escape to Vindor was finally published, I found out I was pregnant with our first child. So life was a whirlwind. It was I just crammed all of life into these, I had all these years ahead of time where I've been working and taking things at my own pace. And now it's okay, all the life events at once. Cool. Awesome. Great. So it was the combination of having finished the duology. Okay, I'm done. And having this time in life where I had two young children, because my second son was born 2 years later, and I was just absolutely in this. I was never diagnosed, but I may have had a postpartum or a like a maternal mood disorder. I think I had depression or something like that, which just happens when you have a huge shift in your life and things are hard for a while. And again, kids are amazing, but they're very demanding when they're very young. And so adjusting to that and all of that. So I really didn't know where to go next. I was just kept looking back to the books I had written, and I just kept trying to write short stories that would point people back to my first two books. And then when my friend reached out and said, do you want to write a completely new book, basically that I've never thought of before? And do you want to write, this retelling and this project? And again, it was this like new idea. And I was like, I can have new ideas. Ooh, new ideas. I like these. And that got me out of my sort of, I was coming out of that difficult period, but I didn't know what to work on. And this spun me in a new direction. And it's great because it's sort of helped me figure out my strategy going forward, which is other books in the world of Vindor that are not necessarily in order. They're not a series. So I've got the first two books, which are a series loosely, and then Crack the Stone can be read before you read those ones. It can be independently, it can be between, it could be after, it can be in any order. And that's sort of, now I'm just doing spinning off Vindor books. And there are Easter eggs for the other books in there, but they are all standalone. And that's the direction that I'm taking for, future books, is they're Vindor books, but they're standalone, any order, and they can sort of introduce you to this world, and you can read all the books or you can just read one. That was sort of the really neat way that, I got stuck for a while, and this is sort of the new direction out. And so I'm excited about it, and there are periods of time where you just can't be creative. Like you just can't, and you can't beat yourself up for it. There are seasons where things are easy. There are seasons where things flow. There are seasons when they don't. And so I think it's just have grace with yourself. And if you're going through, just a really hard time or a really busy time in your life, just, make time for creativity for yourself. But don't feel like I have to keep producing. You can take a break.
Yeah. Yeah, I like
Good
that.
advice.
So I like asking all the authors this. And so who is an author that you love what they're doing?
Oh,
alive today, you can't do a classic
yeah.
author.
Yeah. Oh, well, I will say one author that is my automatic buy author is Peter S. Spiegel. He's not a Christian author. He wrote The Last Unicorn back in in 79 or something. Just a beautiful work of classic fantasy. He wrote some other books, and it's one of those things where I either love his books or I hate them. Like I buy a book and I'm like, is this a love one or a hate one? I don't know, but I will read all of them. Because it's just so interesting. I don't always agree with his decisions, but I'm also but I want to see what decisions you made. So, and he's been an interesting author for me to watch, because it's he had this humongous success with The Last Unicorn, and it was made into a weird movie in the 80s, because 80s fantasy is so weird. Those movies will mess you up. Yeah. But he had this huge success, and then it was I think he wanted to write other things, but everyone's like, are you going to write more unicorn stories? And you're like, well, maybe, but maybe I'll write this, story about a ghost. And I loved the story about a ghost. It was fantastic. But I feel like he is living in the shadow. I don't know him personally. I feel like it's just been interesting to watch, because he made one thing and now he wants to do different things, and he keeps being pulled back to, but you made this thing in the 80s. And he's like, yes, I know, but I would like to make other things now. And just to see how he adapts. And he released a book called I'm Afraid You've Got Dragons, which is about a dragon exterminator. And he'll come when your castle has dragon eggs in the walls and they're just taking over. You need to call this guy and he will come take the dragons out of your walls. And it's fantastic. I've really enjoyed that one. So
that sounds like a picture book.
It's not. It's a novel. It's like a fractured fairy tale, which is kind of what he does really well. But it does have a beautiful illustration from and he lives in Greenville, which is Greenville, South Carolina.
Oh,
Justin Gerard did this real, and his wife Annie Stagg Gerard did these beautiful illustrations for the front and then for the inside cover. Like, and I'm like, I know him. He doesn't remember me. Justin Gerard doesn't remember me, but like I knew his family, so I'm like, I know this guy that I met one time, and now he's famous, and he illustrated a book for one of my favorite authors. So I feel like this is, I don't know, it's like a weird synergy where I'm just like, wow, this is just everything's come full circle. I'm not really involved in this circle, but I feel like I am.
He sounds a lot like the Sherlock Holmes author Arthur Conan Doyle. He had moved
Yeah,
on, kept wanting to do
right.
something else, and they're like, "Yeah, but can you do more Sherlock stories?"
Yeah. Now, I will say I do not know that that's how Peter S. Beagle feels. He might be like, no, I want to do more unicorn stories, but it's just
Yeah.
interesting to watch all the different things he's put out and to be like, does he like want to do something different? And he's written some other good unicorn stories. But they can't compare with The Last Unicorn because it has an 80s movie and it's part of everyone's like childhood, and you can't compete with that, you know? So how do you move on to the next step? So I don't know. I have no idea if he struggles with that or if he goes to sleep every night being like, I helped make that weird 80s movie. I'm just,
Yeah.
so
It's like I gave children nightmares. I can go to sleep nicely now.
it's not as bad as some of the other ones, like Never Ending Story, one of my other favorite books. That movie messed me up. Like there's so many, like what they thought was appropriate children's entertainment in the 80s is very different than our standards today.
Yes.
But they're good movies. Like they really are. They're just maybe a little more intense than like a 7-year-old should be able to handle.
Yes.
yeah. How important is it to be a member of a writer's support group or critique group?
Oh my goodness, so important. I have been with my critique group for 20 years. I joined in
Wow.
2005, and so I actually do have a degree in creative writing because I went to college back in a day before the recession when getting a degree in creative writing was a perfectly acceptable thing to do. I would not recommend it in today's economy. Like, don't do that. But it worked out okay for me because I went into marketing. But I feel like, although I had value from those classes, being part of a writers group made me a better writer than those classes ever did. Okay, not saying my classes didn't have value there, but like the day to day getting a response to your work, like, and this is what I do when I have a new book. I bring it to my writers group and I read it out loud, 5, 6 pages at a time, and I get their reaction. I'm part of a really like supportive writers group where it's a good balance of support. Like they're always nice to you, but they will also tell you when something's not working. And that's
Mhm.
so valuable because I would rather, Nancy tell me that something's not working than like some reviewer tell me that something's not working. You know what I'm saying? Like I would rather have it tested. Um, and to gauge reaction, gauge real-time reaction is super important. Like I was working on one project where everyone was like, oh yeah, it's good, it's good. And then I brought in something else and they're like, oh, this is good. And I'm like, okay, there's a difference.
Yeah.
So now I know which project to work on. They're laughing at this one and it's supposed to be laughed at. So this is the one I'm going to work on. And getting to know other people's work, because sometimes something's not working, but you can't put your finger on it. And when you're in a group like this, especially when you know each other and there's trust, you can help each other solve problems. And sometimes solving someone else's problem or giving suggestions then helps you later on know how to get yourself out of a corner you've written yourself into.
Mhm.
We do occasionally, there's one guy who brings this story and we're always like, these two characters need to get married. And he's like, but no, no. Like, we're like, no, no, they do. So like sometimes it can be a little unhelpful, like wish fulfillment, but like mostly we're giving each other like plot point things. Sometimes we tell people, what if you killed this character? We try not to do that too much, but we just like to float ideas, because sometimes you just get yourself written into a corner and you need other people to help you brainstorm how to get out of it. And that's just so valuable. Like taking classes is great, but like having somebody And again, for me, for 20 years, having people once a month look at my writing and respond to it and me get to help them work through their issues or listen in, because I don't know how to solve everybody's problem, obviously, but listen in as other people chime in. You learn so much that way. So I would say join that critique group, maybe take your writing course. Don't necessarily get a degree in this because, economy is different than it was in the early 2000s. But yeah, writing critique group, even if it's just like you can find them on Discord, the online platforms. I still meet in person with my group, but you can find them on Discord. You can find them through a community, like a writers conference community, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right to Ignite,
actually
just, throwing that out there. Yeah.
And it's a
Yeah.
Zoom. We meet on Zoom. It's so easy.
Yeah. Yeah. Zoom is great. When during COVID, my group went to Zoom and I honestly could not remember. Later on, I could remember what people said, but I couldn't remember if we were in Zoom or in real life. Like, it was that much the same, except one of them I was probably wearing pajama pants and the real life one I was not. So that's the main difference.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Well, Emily was gracious enough to offer a giveaway to our listeners. If you want a chance to not only win Escape to Vindor, but Vindor swag, such as a mini map, a full color Vindor bookmark of your choice, 3 Vindor stickers, and a Vindor key, here's how you enter. Comment on this blog post. Emily, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. I really had a great time.
And thank you so much for listening, and I hope you will tune into the next episode. In the meantime, keep writing and igniting those hearts for the Lord.